ladies, MBs and gents. This is a video about the concept of publicly controlling the media. In the UK we already have a publicly controlled media company, the BBC, that is the British Broadcasting Corporation. If you're American, you're probably used to having your programming constantly interrupted with commercial breaks. With the BBC, however, this is not the case, given as it isn't funded by advertisers, rather it is funded by what's known as the TV licence. If you want to watch TV in the UK, you need to pay for a TV licence, and the money from everyone's TV licence is what funds the BBC. The BBC not only don't have commercial breaks, they aren't allowed to have commercial breaks. They also aren't allowed to do any paid product placement in programming. In 1955, an alternative channel was launched, ITV, that is, Independent Television. As the name would suggest, ITV is not publicly funded and rather is funded by advertisers. Ergo, much like American television, programming is often interrupted with commercial breaks. So what are the differences and similarities? Well, whereas ITV have to act in the interests of their advertisers, the BBC have to act directly in the interests of the public. To give you an example, the BBC doesn't just do television, they also do radio. BBC Radio 1 actually lost listeners following the decision to replace Chris Moyles with Nick Grimshaw. For a commercial radio station, this would have been a disaster. After all, if less people are listening, then advertisers are less likely to want to advertise. However, the BBC is not a commercial station. The public funding they receive is not dependent upon their attracting large audiences. The reason Moyles was replaced was largely because the audience he was attracting was older than it was supposed to be, given the time slot. This is an example of the sort of differing priorities a publicly controlled station can have compared to a commercial station. Whereas commercial stations have a commitment to their advertisers, the BBC has a commitment to the arts and to providing a diversity of content. Because the BBC is publicly controlled, it is duty-bound to be politically impartial, especially when reporting the news. The BBC will show party political broadcasts, but they have to show them for all the prominent political parties. It would be a severe act of malpractice to show a party political broadcast on behalf of the Conservative Party, but not also show a party political broadcast on behalf of the Labour Party. But what about ITV? Can they be as opinionated and biased as they like? I mean, they're independent, right? Well, you might think that, especially if you're American and you're accustomed to channels like Fox News. However, despite being an independent station, ITV still operate under the auspices of Ofcom, which clearly state that they must, like the BBC, be politically impartial. In short, there is no equivalent of Fox News in the UK. We do have newspapers that show obvious signs of political bias, and notably more of them show a right-wing bias than a left-wing bias. This isn't especially surprising, given as we live in a capitalist society and capitalism is a right-wing way of doing things. If your name's Rupert Murdoch and you have a lot of money, thanks to capitalism, then you can afford to purchase a large number of media platforms and use them to promote capitalism, thus ensuring that you continue to have a lot of money and you can continue to purchase media platforms and use them to promote capitalism, and so on and so on. A good example of this sort of insidious manipulation of the media was in 1968, when Murdoch used his influence to swing the Australian Liberal Party election so as John Gorton would become Prime Minister rather than Billy McMahon. Similarly, due to his business interest in China, bad news from there was heavily censored by News International. I'd also speculate that if you have a lot of money, you can afford to be sued more than someone with considerably less money. This might go some way to explaining why The Sun, also owned by Murdoch, is as inflammatory as it is and doesn't seem to be especially deterred by the fact it gets sued a lot of the time. If you can afford the occasional lawsuit, then you can afford to spread a certain amount of inflammatory bullshit. So, what about YouTube and other social media? There's been a lot of talk of late about how these sorts of sites are run, including a few conspiracy theories about them being politically manipulated. In the case of YouTube, it's a lot more akin to ITV than to the BBC, in that it is funded by advertisers, ergo it has to put the interests of advertisers first. If you're wondering why the recent changes to what does and does not qualify for monetization have occurred, it's essentially because advertisers don't just want lots of views, although they certainly do want that, but they also want to avoid any negative associations of their products. To quote McNair, companies do on occasion withdraw or threaten to withdraw advertisements from publications of which they disapprove. In the USA, for example, big advertisers like Chrysler have been known to put pressure on editors not to publish material on controversial subjects like homosexuality. As Chrysler put it in one letter to potential recipients of its advertising revenue, Chrysler expects to be alerted in advance about any piece of writing with a sexual, political, or social content that might possibly be construed as provocative. In America too, Sports Illustrated magazine reportedly lost $1 million worth of advertising revenue when it published a profile of a gay athlete. People who think that the left wing is somehow insidiously controlling the media would do well to take note of the aforementioned. If you're someone who has ambitions of using YouTube or Twitter as a platform for harassment, and no, I'm not interested in getting into a pedantic argument with you as to what does and does not constitute harassment, then I'm afraid public control of social media is unlikely to help your cause. The BBC is publicly controlled, and while it has been criticised at times for allegedly failing to be impartial, it certainly isn't a platform for harassment or hate speech, not least because being publicly controlled, it is duty-bound to act in the interest of the public at large. Were it to start allowing hate speech, it would be failing grossly in its responsibility to be impartial. A small and vicious portion of the general public do not speak for the general public at large. What's also important to note here is that if you're a free market capitalist, you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't, on the one hand, argue that the media should be privately owned and that private businesses should be able to operate with a minimum of government interference, while simultaneously arguing that media should somehow be controlled by the public. Those positions are contradictory in the extreme. Personally, I'm a socialist, and therefore I am in favour of the idea of public control of the media. But, unlike Free's Peach Warriors, I believe in this so as the media isn't dominated by any one particular type of political view or genre of the creative arts. There are a couple of ways you could go about doing this. Let's take Fox News, for example. They obviously aren't impartial and thus don't serve the public at large, ergo it would be unreasonable to expect the public to fund them via anything like a TV licence. So if it were proposed that Fox News were to receive public funding, it could be done either by demanding that they begin living up to their claim of being fair and balanced and stop reporting the news with an obvious conservative bias, or they could continue to operate as they do, but an equal amount of public funding would be assigned to a left-wing news channel. In this scenario, of course, Fox News would certainly be required to lose the fair and balanced tag and replace it with something more accurate, such as the conservative perspective. I also think it would be nice if there were at least one publicly funded news channel that did report the news impartially in America. Similarly, if we were to tell YouTube that we wanted them to put the interests of the public ahead of the interests of advertisers, an obvious reaction would be, well, then the public need to start funding us then. So YouTube could be granted public funding on the grounds that they alter themselves as a platform somehow so as they don't just serve a disproportionate section of the public. Forcing political vloggers to be impartial would be somewhat heavy-handed, so a better option might be for YouTubers to declare their political interests and for YouTube to ensure equal promotion for both left and right-wing content creators. Though given as the political spectrum is a lot more complicated than just left and right, obviously a lot of time and effort would have to be put into creating a policy. The same would stand for creative YouTubers. If YouTube were publicly funded, it couldn't be seen to be disproportionately promoting certain types of music or certain types of independent film. It would be required to offer up equal promotion. For example, instead of telling us what's popular right now, how about telling us what's not popular right now? What is currently under-promoted? That's a brief overview of the concept of the public controlling the media. I hope it's been of interest. Thanks for watching.